Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. This is the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. Join me as we venture into the heart of an era that has shaped legends. Assassin's Creed Shadows takes place in 1579 in medieval Japan. It's a seminal period in Japanese history, renowned for its samurai and shinobi, or as we might know them better, ninja. It's a time rich in history, culture and stories, so I wanted to spend some time exploring this fascinating chapter in history by speaking to experts from across the globe. We'll navigate the intricate landscapes of power and ambition which you'll be able to explore in Assassin's Creed Shadows, and introduce you to the major figures who dominated and defined the era. In this episode, Dr. Chris Harding from the University of Edinburgh will help us understand the warring states of the Sengoku period and the unification of Japan. Nate Ledbetter from Princeton University will shed light on arguably the key figure of the whole period, who you'll be able to encounter in the game. And Dr. Kate Kitagawa will give me a taste of what it would actually be like to live in medieval Japan, and whether being a samurai was all it's really cracked up to be. Let's dive into the echoes of history. Okay, Chris, can you help us to locate Assassin's Creed Shadows in the world? We know we're in Japan, we're in the Sengoku period. What does that mean in terms of when we are? And I guess for a bit of context, can you tell us a bit about what else might be happening in the world that we might be familiar with?
Yes, so this is the 1460s in Japan, running for at least a century into the 1560s, and some historians would give it another few years after that. So at least a century or more of this all-against-all warfare between some of the different fiefs that we're going to be talking about. And for context elsewhere, you've got the Tudors in England, beginning with Henry VII's seizure of the crown in 1485. You've also got, I suppose, almost but not quite midway between England and Japan, India, where from the 1520s you have the rise of the Mughal dynasty, who are in power there for a good couple of centuries. So relative dynastic stability in England and India, but pretty much chaos in Japan.
Sounds like an ideal place to set an Assassin's Creed game. Yeah. And what was feudal medieval Japan like before the upheavals of the Sengoku period? How is Japanese society ordered?
So for a while, for a few centuries, thinking about maybe the 600s through to around 1100 or so, Japan is ruled more or less by an emperor based in what we now call Kyoto, alongside an aristocracy, who most of whom are based in Kyoto and own these vast tracts of land elsewhere. And then across the 1100s, you have the rise of these warrior bands, who initially are just employed by aristocrats as bodyguards in Kyoto, or to look after their concerns out in the countryside. And I think that partly explains why you get the rise of warrior bands who, after a while, don't just work for an aristocratic employer, but actually have loyalty to one another within their group. So this concept of vassals starts to develop. This gets to the point actually from the 1100s, the late 1100s onwards, where Japan is ruled de facto by warrior governments, what we would call shogunates. A Kamakura shogunate from the late 12th century through to the early 14th, and then the Ashikaga shogunate after that. So just before this era of chaos breaks out, Japan has had a few centuries of warrior rule.
During those shogunates, does the position of the emperor still exist? Is he still there, or is he pushed aside completely during those periods?
So the emperor is always there in Kyoto. The notion of a shogun, it means something like barbarian crushing generalissimo. So there in the title is the fact that this individual officially works for the emperor. His role is to go out there and crush the emperor's enemies. But in fact, it's the shoguns who organize taxes, the shoguns who says who gets which pieces of land, and the shoguns who issue these legal codes and oversee a system of judgment. So in every meaningful way, the shoguns are in charge.
And so if that's the role and the position of a shogun, essentially he's the head of government. Just thinking of another couple of words that might crop up when we think about medieval Japan. What is a samurai? I mean, samurai has got to be a word that everybody knows, but what does it really mean?
So it comes from the verb meaning to serve. So initially the ethos was that these people were trained bodyguards, so they might stand outside the door of a particularly high-strung aristocrat. And it's the sense of being, I think, a professional warrior on that basis and passing on those skills to the next generation. The key change that I think happens across the 1100s is that the object of loyalty for the samurai changes from being the employer who pays them to actually being a senior member of their band, maybe related by blood. And you start to have these hierarchies within the samurai. That really is the focus of their loyalty, of their entire ethos. So the whole samurai culture that develops is quite divorced from this idea of basically a paid bodyguard, which is how they begin. In the aftermath of the Sengoku period, once Japan enters this period of settled fiefdoms, which are almost completely independent, the fact that the top samurai in each fief, called the daimyo, is more or less an autocratic ruler with nothing to do with anybody else outside his fiefdom. The samurai structure underneath him, I think, comes to matter all the more. So I think there's that shift all the way through, and it probably reaches its height in the period just after the Sengoku era, I would say.
I think it's one of those things we tend to view it as quite a static thing. We think a samurai is a thing, but a samurai is actually a concept, an idea that evolves and changes. Another word that you mentioned there, daimyo, can we get a bit of an idea of what the daimyo was and what he did?
Yes. So when the old shogunates were working properly, I was saying a moment ago, you've got the Kamakura shogunate, then you've got the Ashikaga shogunate after that. These are two different shogunates with two different families controlling them. One follows on from the other. In theory, in that system, the way they control the rest of Japan is they send out what are called shugo, these warrior constables, you could call them. So people in their employ, they'll send them out to these provinces and they'll say, you look after law and order for us out there, make sure you hold on to this province. If we need to raise troops out there, you can take care of that. Those sorts of roles for the shugo, who may, when they initially went out to that part of Japan, have had no family connection at all. But what happens, I think, during the Sengoku period is that some of these warrior constables, they actually put down roots in these areas. They make alliances, they perhaps marry, they come to have much more autonomy and control over what goes on within that territory than they initially did when they were parachuted in by the shogunate. So a fully fledged daimyo, which is what emerges at the end of this process, is someone who is in absolute control of his province or his domain and who needs to answer to nobody else. So some of the really wealthy daimyo, when we're getting into perhaps the mid 1500s, for example, might now and again lend the shogun a bit of money or pay for an imperial palace to be done up if it's been damaged. But that would be charity rather than something you have to do. So it's that sense of real complete independence within their fiefdom. At the beginning of the Sengoku era, we have what's called the Onin War, running from 1467 to 1477. Huge damage done to Kyoto in the process of this war. It begins as a kind of succession dispute within the shogunate, but an enormous proportion of Kyoto is destroyed in fire. Lots of these different warrior constables from around the country end up coming to the Kyoto region to get involved. When that war ends, some of them go back to their provinces to find that someone else has usurped them. And that someone else who has usurped them manages to solidify their own power until they become what we would call daimyo, this real independent warlord. And in other cases, the warrior constables, when they go back to their provinces, they're the ones who manage to do that. Because this war, this Onin War, this 10-year conflict, pretty much destroys the idea of a functional shogunate.
If we get into then what the Sengoku period really was, it's also sometimes called the Warring States period. What are we really talking about?
So it's a period when central authority in Japan has completely gone. So you've still got the emperor in Kyoto, but as we were saying a moment ago, they're kind of impoverished and not really able to do very much politically or militarily. You've also still got a shogun, but they're also extremely poor. If anyone listening to this or watching this has been to Kyoto and has seen Ginkakuji, which is the silver pavilion, they may have been disappointed to find that there's no actual silver on it. It's instead got this kind of withered wood look to it, which people appreciate aesthetically for what it is. But it was supposed to have silver on it. And the reason that it doesn't is that it was built in the 1480s during this period when the shogun's power and wealth was dwindling to almost nothing. They basically didn't have the cash to do anything at all. So against that backdrop where you don't have a shogunate that can really extend its authority beyond Kyoto, what you have is these regional leaders becoming daimyo, as we were saying a moment ago, trying to secure their fiefs, in some cases trying to use warfare, marriage alliances, other kinds of dealings to extend their power. It's pretty much an all against all. It's not warfare wall to wall for an entire century, but certainly on and off it becomes quite bloody.
It'd be really good to understand the kind of weaponry and tactics and the military mindset that prevails in Japan as they move into this period.
Early on, you have a sense of samurai warfare where the ideal would be for a samurai mounted on horseback to call out to someone on the opposing side and to have this, what we might think of as a kind of gentlemanly one-to-one combat. But during this period, that changes. It comes to be partly all about numbers. So a really important feature of warfare in this period, I think, is the humble foot soldier, ashigaru in Japanese. At the beginning, they're thought about pretty much as cannon fodder. They're not really given much armor, much protection at all. They're thought to be pretty replaceable. They're just pretty much peasants who are fighting in exchange for loot, for whatever they can pick up on the battlefield. But then things start to change. They do become of more value because you can see they're being given armor, they're being given specific roles on the battlefield. And I think one of the most important roles they're given, this is certainly true of the armies that Oda Nobunaga runs, is they are trained in firearms. So in the middle of the 1500s, first contact is made with the Portuguese. They arrive off Japan's southern shore. And one of the things they're bringing alongside Christianity is firearms. Quite quickly, the Japanese are able to develop their own version of these firearms. And quite soon, they're on the battlefields. If you were a top samurai in this period and you really valued your life, one of the things you would look for is a suit of armor that perhaps has a few little dents in it because it's proof that it can withstand a bullet as opposed to letting one through.
And apart from those kind of battlefield tactics and the men who are being deployed around the place, I guess when we think about Europe during this period, we're maybe seeing a move away from castles and castle warfare and sieges. They're becoming less important. Where did Japan stand during this period in terms of castles? What did castles look like in Japan and how important were they still during this period?
I think castles remained really important in Japan for this time, I suppose for a number of reasons. Most obviously, their defensive value. So you have these enormous, many feet thick sloping stone walls, a series of stone walls around the castle. You've got a series of moats as well. You've got the central donjon, it's called, which can be 6 or 7 stories high. So I think they were really important for defensive purposes, extraordinarily difficult to successfully attack a castle like that. I think what they also provided is a degree of security not just for armies, but also for ordinary people if there were to be a sudden attack on a particular domain. So in some of these castles, what you see is a mini town growing up around it. So these castles, if they were felt to be secure places, they would draw lots of people, lots of different crafts people, tradespeople, merchants, etc., to come and set up their homes and shops all around the castle, which in turn is very useful for someone like Oda Nobunaga, who wants to try to raise these enormous armies. Obviously, that costs money. So if you have a thriving economy around your fortified castle town, basically, then it allows allows you to raise the kind of money that you need to gather together, tens of thousands of troops and feed them and equip them. So I suppose in all those ways, castles were quite important in this period.
Do we see a lot of siege warfare during this period in Japan? And I guess how different might that look from European siege warfare at the time?
Now and again, I suppose there's a really good example of siege warfare involving Oda Nobunaga. So in Japan, you have these different Buddhist sects. And one of them, called Jodo Shinshu, was particularly powerful and particularly worrying for Oda Nobunaga because the people in this particular sect could be kitted out at the last minute to become a kind of pop-up army, so that the patriarch, for want of a better word, of this particular sect could issue a statement against Oda Nobunaga, as he did, declaring him an enemy and saying that people would be rewarded in the next life if they stand up against him. And followers of this sect included some fairly wealthy merchants who could effectively equip themselves and feed themselves. So the danger of these pop-up armies appearing almost out of nowhere was extraordinary for Oda Nobunaga. And so he launched a siege against the main compound in Osaka of the Jodo Shinshu sect, which lasted actually for a while. It wasn't entirely successful because Osaka, of course, is on the water. And so the patriarch had allies, kind of pirate daimyo, I suppose you could call them, who for a while would supply the castle by sea. But Oda Nobunaga managed to defeat those pirates at sea, and so after a while the Jodo Shinshu sect, holed up in this kind of fortified temple complex in Osaka, had to give up. So there were quite remarkable sieges along the way, accompanied, it has to be said, certainly in the case of someone like Nobunaga, with extraordinary slaughter. Just gives you an idea of how bloody and uncompromising some of this warfare could be.
And so for the Sengoku period, we seem to have a situation where the power of the shogun has kind of fractured, and we get numerous local daimyo then establishing their own power bases, but also a lingering drive to bring it back together and for everyone someone to conquer everybody and reunite Japan? Or is everyone happy with the idea that it's split into lots of different states at this point?
I think there is always the idea that Japan has been a single polity in the past and should be again. I don't think there is a celebration of war for the sake of it by any means. And so what anyone at a serious level anyway of influence in this period would like to see is the nation maybe not quite the right word, but the country anyway, brought back together, that Kyoto should be the natural center of power, but that ideally, certainly someone like Oda Nobunaga, he would want to be the person who is fully in charge of that. So although it's a long period of time, it's a century, the Japanese, I suppose not unlike the British actually, have a very long history, are very conscious of that history. You have chronicles, you have poetry, you have songs, you have all sorts of things there in the culture that remind people of what the natural, if you like, divinely ordained state of affairs ought to be.
What sort of source material do we have for this period in Japan? Do we have to be slightly careful about where it's coming from? Is it the voices of the powerful, those daimyo who are in conflict, or do we have fairly good source material that allows us to get to the bottom of what's really going on?
We have, for example, for some of the battle scenes, we have painted screens which show roughly what was going on and how these battles were being fought. I think within some of the larger families, you have chronicles of what their great members have done. Certainly someone like Oda Nobunaga has that. You have individual writings by some of the samurai. For a while, part of the way things went on a battlefield was that whatever your deeds were, if you wanted to be, as a samurai, if you wanted to be rewarded for them, you had to have some kind of a record of them. Whether you were writing down what you'd done, whether you kept some kind of trophy from the people who you have killed, whatever it might be. Those sorts of things, I think, become records as well. We also have records from within some of these great Buddhist sects. I think you could say, couldn't you, thinking about them, they are largely elite sources for the most part. But nevertheless, I think it's quite a lot of material, both written and visual, that gives us a real feel for what was going on.
Welcome to Echoes of History, Kate. It's fantastic to have you here.
Good to see you.
I'm really excited to get into everyday life in Japan. How would we fit in if we found ourselves in feudal Japan as players of Assassin's Creed Shadows are about to? So if we're in the Sengoku period in Japan, who do you think you'd be, Kate? Are we peasant farmers? Are we merchants? I mean, obviously, I'm the most legendary samurai of all time. That's how I imagine myself in feudal Japan. But where do you see yourself?
I would also like to be a strong samurai because that's probably the high chance of survival. Maybe like peasants in the countryside would be my second choice. But I would go with your scenario. Maybe we both become the strong samurai.
I think we would make a fantastic team. And we would almost definitely take feudal Japan by storm, Kate.
That's right.
How is feudal society in Japan set up? Is there a class system similar to what we might recognise in the UK? You know, we have our class system. Is there that kind of categorisation to society?
So the most famous categorization that we know of now started sometime in the 17th century. So it was something like a pyramid. You know, there's the strong samurai, you know, known as shogun. It will be ruling, but also there was an emperor. So this is like a high class, just very like few people at the top. And then there would be, you know, samurai class, you know, the people with sword and they have like the great fighting skills and so on. And then below that, there will be farmers and then artisans and merchants. So those people were, you know, in a hierarchy, like a pyramid. And it has been known as, you know, class system installed strongly during the 17th century. But before that, there are like long history of a samurai ruling. And then back then, especially the time we called Sengoku, people were moving like, you know, more freely between the classes. But then, you know, those kind of systems are strongly like, you know, becoming more structural and then, you know, leading up to the feudal, you know, society in the 17th and 18th century.
I'm quite interested that when you listed that structure of society, farmers came above artisans and merchants. And I think in lots of Western cultures, it's possibly the other way around, that we would consider the farmers to be beneath the artisans and the merchants.
Right. So merchants are at the bottom and then farmers are, you know, above them. So what happens to that structure is to praise farmers' work even more and then to suppress the wrongdoings of merchants, because merchants having like lots of money and they have like skills to, you know, have the commercial activities going on. If they are like higher up, you know, near a samurai, then there will be a high chance of having a conflict between them. So they decided that merchants to be at the bottom so that they have like less respect regarding the social class. But then they'll still be able to do commerce and also, you know, a lot of like money lending and all other activities that let the society move forward.
Interesting. So the idea that they could become wealthy and powerful is counteracted by giving them much less status within society to stop them being a threat to the ruling samurai classes.
That's right.
Fascinating.
Money was scary.
What kind of jobs and what kind of crafts would people in feudal Japan have been engaged in? So we obviously have the farmers who are working the land, but what other jobs and crafts are available?
Well, maybe one important thing is the sword makers, because, you know, those swords and also all other armors, like, you know, it has to be very strong and, you know, prestigious and expensive. So those are the professionals that will make these swords for life. Or, you know, only like armors for life. So those people are really like, you know, succeeding their businesses over generations. And other businesses, unfortunately, there is a marginalized class that they dealt with, like say butchering and also like some sort of like dirty work. So that, you know, they were isolated from the main, you know, stream society. And they have been recognized as like a specialized group, but also some sort of like prejudice over this group. So those are, you know, different sort of jobs that we recognize in history.
And was there much movement between those social classes? Could someone who was born a farmer, could they rise through the ranks and become a daimyo or a local ruler of any kind? Or were things much more strictly controlled in terms of the levels of society?
Strictly controlled. So unfortunately, there are not like sudden moves between the classes. So usually, you know, farmers being registered as farmers, and then they will be farmers forever. So back then, during this Sengoku period, when the class systems were not really, you know, rigid, then back then, those are people who had the sword, you know, was recognized as samurai. Then, the people who did not have the sword were peasants. So those like two types to begin with. And then at one point that, this separation started to happen, and then there is almost no point of return. So, since then, the guys who were the family and also the clans that started to have training in martial arts, meaning like they have the swords and weapons, they become the samurai. And then the rest, it's always been fixed since the 17th century onward.
And if we're aspiring samurai, we're gonna find our sword maker, we're gonna find our armor maker, and you and I are gonna take feudal Japan by storm, Kate. But while we're preparing to do that, where are we living? What do houses look like during this period in the countryside and in the towns?
They're very simple. So the countryside and towns, so they had the simple structure of just a roof and then some basic structures. And sometimes if somebody decides to do, say, have a fish market or some sort of market in front of their house, and then, that's an origin of merchants class. But then they did have those, decorations on the facade. And then they will have, something to sell, in front of their houses. So that's a very basic structure. But for the higher classes, they had some sort of symbolization by building the tall sort of castles, for example. That's very visible sign of power. So the castle, it has to have the structure of sort of visible strategy. So sometimes, the sea or sort of canal surrounding it. So it's not just a tower, because if just a tower, then somebody will come and, knock this out. So that's not great. So they have to show, some sort of wisdom of, having the barricade, wisely decorated, on the side of the castle. And then it has to be tall so that they can see or oversee the whole town and so on. So the house for the samurai becomes those kind of inner quarter of, this structure, let's say castle keep. So then they would have, some sort of, symbolized lifestyle that the ruler would have. Also, there is a special sort of structure related to the house is the tea house. You might have heard about the samurai practicing the tea ceremony, for example. And then tea ceremony has been done in a small room, and it's usually decorated specially for this, but decoration has to be very simple. So it's not much of, decoration, having the items all over, but it's very simple. And then it has a structure representing the calmness and representing its own sort of traditions and so on. And sometimes the flowers, just having that little, flower display that would help also to, show how this, simple space would speak. So this tea house is not higher up in a castle, but usually separated. And then sometimes even in a mountainside. So those are the, structures that's probably unique to the Japanese samurai society.
Who would live in a family home? Did the Japanese people during this period keep extended families close to home, or did they tend to sort of move out of home quite early?
Right. Interesting question. So the merchants or those people who started to sell specialized goods, they will be passing this business to the next generations. That means the family will stay closer together, right? And necessarily. So that usually the main house will have the first son and the second son and then the third son somewhere in the region. And then the business will just keep on going, until the next one will find the successor. And then the next one will find the next successor and so on. So this structure let the family become very close. And then family structure of the samurai as well, that they will have to be tight group. They have to be bonded very strongly, especially, when they become a massive force, then they can't really have an internal conflict. Ideally not, right? So they will have to have those structures, and then the relatives will become the close vassals, for example, so that they will all live somewhere close. So imagine there is a castle. The ruler will be at the top, and then they will have the village of the relatives and also close vassals. So related clans. So they all live at one place. And then this is a merchant's group living and then selling the specialized goods to all the people, including the samurai. So the structure of the town started to become more categorized. And then also, the samurai's region, like this is a samurai village. So the samurai started to live together, and then the market started to develop and flourish. And then those regional sort of specializations started to become more visible as the class system started to become fixed.
And one of the other things I'd like to talk a little bit about is what you and I might have worn if we found ourselves in Sengoku, Japan. For women, we associate the kimono perhaps most closely with Japanese society. Is that what most women would have worn, or is that unusual?
Oh, it is usual formal clothing. So the kimono is the thing that the woman would wear. And also for men as well, that they would wear kimono, but in a different sort of style and made. And with this family crest sometimes, like, here and there around the neck. So you can see on the kimono where which clan that you belong to. And also peasants too, they wore cotton, but also like kimono style make. So that it is the same, so they will look like, they are wearing the same style of clothing.
So were the styles between sort of the upper and lower classes less about different shapes and styles of clothing and just more to do with the quality?
So when I looked at folding screens made in the 17th century, the beginning of 17th century, they are a depiction of women. So the high class woman had umbrella and she wore a hat. So that would be a huge difference that it makes, because in the lower class women, they will wear kimono in a similar style, like just a low quality, but they will not usually have an umbrella.
In what other ways would being a woman in feudal Japan have influenced your life during the period there? I mean, I guess, I'm much more focused, on medieval European society where women were treated very badly, kind of set to one side, often marginalised. In what other ways would being a woman make your life different from that of a man?
So women started to become financially independent during the Sengoku time. So that's something different from other societies. So, the other societies, why the women stayed, in the sort of like second class is that financially they will have to be dependent on their father or their husbands, or even their sons. But then around the time of the unification of Japan, the Japanese women started to have the financial independence as one of the quality of life that they will have to sustain, so that sometimes even the father died or husband died or, any relatives died, that they themselves can live. So, it's like a starting point of having a little bit of equality, a little bit of more rights in a society by claiming her own land or, financial assets and so on. So I think, they started to realize also about, this, getting into the financial transaction, that has made a great impact to the, samurai world. It's not only men that could own the lands and wealth.
So one of the other things we would need to do to fit in feudal Japan is to be able to find food for ourselves. We need to be able to eat. So players in the game, they're trying to meld into feudal Japan and to pass for part of society. So if we were looking for a meal in Sengoku, Japan, what kind of food might we be eating? And is that different depending on our class?
Right. Usually the basic food are the same. So the special food, like seasonal ones or very expensive ones, those are being consumed by the samurais and then ruling classes. But the very basic things, like say rice, and grains, mixed with fish, everyone sort of shared in the society. So they used to eat twice per day. So one is obviously sometime like around breakfast, and then they will have another meal at night. And meal itself, as I said, will be simple, like say miso soup. There's a soup that comes with the grain, and then those salted, because preservatives is almost always salt. So the salted fish, like salted pickles, and then those combination are the basics. And then some unusual seasonal food, like the fish that only comes into this season, or some sort of chestnuts, and then also some wealthy people will drink sake.
But I really feel like I would have struggled with the 2 meals a day as a greedy man. I like my 3 meals a day. I feel like 2 would not be enough for me. Mm-hmm. What would we do if we wanted to relax? Were there games in medieval Japan that we know about?
Right. One thing that the samurai ruler, especially the unifier Toyotomi Hideyoshi liked, was the no play. And then that's very joyous to watch. And at the same time, the samurai liked to even play by themselves so that they could play the role of like person A, showing up at these scenes and so on. So that becomes like more sort of, intellectual exercise, combined with the games and joy. So I think that no play is a really good feature of that time. Also like chess. Many people still play chess and they're really fascinating game. So similar to chess, Japan had Go, even like, the merchant class and then artisans class, they enjoy that as well. And from a long time ago, Japanese people like the haiku poems, so the haiku has a longer version that can be saying like, so I will say, first part and then Matt will continue and then I will reply, depending on what Matt started to create, it could be the story that I will continue. It could be a reply to like what you have said. So those kind of, wordplay that always been really interesting and in long, standing culture of Japan.
Amazing. It sounds like a kind of medieval haiku rap battle that we could get engaged in.
That's right. Yes. Yep.
As much as I would like to think of myself as the greatest samurai of all time if I were in feudal Japan, I'd probably be rubbish. I'd really struggle with 2 meals a day. I'd probably faint. How do you think you would have fared? Could you have lived in Sengoku Japan?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. I think I will secretly eat the third meal. That's probably the point to survive if I could be wealthy enough. But I think the Sengoku Japan was very critical that people thought about the system, how the, human has to be living, what the meanings of the family, love, and life itself. So I think, that was a time that people really lived, even the short time, there are some unfortunate incidences of death and so on. But I think the Sengoku time that I really cherish as a historian. And if I were there at that time, that I would probably have life that I would be convinced that I lived.
If I could steal that third meal, and if you and I could find decent sword makers, I feel like we could take Japan.
That's right.
Or at least we could have a go. We could be the most legendary samurai together. We have been kind of skirting around this guy, Oda Nobunaga. We've mentioned him several times. He crops up obviously a lot during this history. So I'm really looking forward to getting under his skin a little bit. If he's born in 1534, it sounds like he's born in the middle of a pretty chaotic period, but he's also of relatively humble origins, which obviously makes it all the more impressive what he goes on to achieve. What do we know about what his early life is like? Who are his family and what position of power are they in?
The Oda family, of which Nobunaga is the most famous, they were the deputy governors underneath the Shiba family in Owari, and he's born as the first legitimate son of a man named Oda Nobuhide. So when Nobunaga is born in 1534, the Oda family effectively had control of Owari province at this point, though the family itself was fractured, and Nobunaga's branch was interestingly not the primary lineage. So kind of to sum up the whole idea of the Warring States period, we have these fractures at almost all levels of military society. So Nobunaga's youth would have been one where his family was in constant conflict, both internally and externally. He was designated Nobuhide's heir rather early on, and given the education that you would expect of an heir. But it's often said he was a bit of a wild child who preferred, running around with his friends rather than studying, out hunting and raising all kinds of ruckus. Allegedly, he wore outlandish outfits like, a tiger skin cloak. And generally, he didn't really act the part of an up-and-coming warlord. You'll often hear that he was called the Fool of Owari. And whether this is true or not, whether this was an act to throw enemies off guard or, accurate and he really was just kind of, off in his own little world, is hard to know for sure.
It sounds a bit like one of those annoying rich kids. He's got all dad's money and a nice car to drive around in, being flash and everything else, but not taking the role very seriously at this point. What happens then when Nobuhide dies? Does he manage to succeed his father smoothly?
Smooth is the last thing that you would probably call it. So Nobuhide dies in 1551, and despite Nobunaga being his heir, there's some contention based on his pattern of erratic behavior. One of the famous events that is often brought up is at Nobuhide's funeral. Nobunaga shows up allegedly very unkempt, not in the proper formal funeral attire, and acts very disrespectfully, throwing incense at the altar instead of performing the proper respectful rituals. And based off of this, we are told that some of his father's vassals form a faction around his younger brother, while other branches of the family see this as an opportunity for them to seize control, push this loser who's not ready for the job out of the way. His position upon his father's death is actually very precarious. This somewhat changes. In 1553, one of his senior retainers commits suicide, and he does this to wake up young Nobunaga to his rather outlandish behavior and how it's being detrimental to both, his own well-being and the well-being of the Oda family. How much of this is actually how things went down, it's almost impossible to say, but it does seem that from this point, there is a bit of a change in attitude, and he does begin to more seriously concentrate on consolidating his control over Owari and the Oda family.
There's a really interesting parallel, I guess, in English history to Shakespeare's version of Henry V, who he paints as this wild child who immediately that he comes to the throne has this real conversion to an incredibly serious and driven person. And it sounds like Nobunaga falls into that category a little bit, has a bit of a reputation, but we don't know how much he deserves it. So having had this, what's positioned as a wake-up call for him, how does Nobunaga then go about gaining control?
His first fight is to simply gain control of his own family. Initially from 1550 to 1554, he's contending with iterations of rebellion from his uncle, Nobutomo, who conspired to assassinate him. Nobunaga, catches him and forgives him once, but, second time, Nobunaga captures him and has him put to death. In 1556, again, out of fears that Nobunaga is just not up to the task, several of his major retainers side with his younger brother, Nobuyuki, but Nobunaga, warned of potential treachery, at one point feigns an illness instead of going to go meet his brother. So his brother comes to meet him, and when he does, Nobunaga has him and his entourage assassinated. So the 1550s is really the story of Nobunaga's consolidation of his power within the Oda family, establishing himself as the leader of the family, and this ends the internal threats. Now he's daimyo of the Oda family and in control of Owari province.
How does he then go about looking outward and beyond his own borders? Because his province is quite a small one comparatively as well, isn't it?
Yes, so Owari is small, but Japan is very mountainous, right? So there's only a few large flat areas where cultivation can take place at large scale. And Owari happens to sit in one of these, the Nobi Plain. So while it's a small province, it's a particularly wealthy one. So it's a good place to be based out of. It's far enough away from the capital that you're not in the middle of the intrigues and plots going on there. But it's close enough that you can get there if you decide to be part of those plots. In 1560, the powerful daimyo Imagawa Yoshimoto to his east, he decides, or it's usually assumed at least that he decides, that he's going to make a run at marching on the capital of Kyoto to take charge of the central government. And so he gathers together an army of 25,000 troops and begins his march east. And the first stop is, of course, his neighbor in Owari province, Nobunaga. So he has to go through Nobunaga's domain. And, on paper, this is going to be very easy. He's got 25,000 troops, which at the time was a very large army, massive. And Nobunaga only has a few thousand men. So, maybe 2,500. So we're looking at roughly around a 10-to-1 disadvantage. But Nobunaga Despite the fact that his advisors counsel him to withdraw into his castle, he decides that his best course of action is to try to seek an opening and attack. And we have this almost legendary victory by Oda Nobunaga, outmanned 10-1, destroying the forces of this great daimyo. So it kind of makes a name for Nobunaga. So his next target is this province to his north, Mino province, which is, it's much larger in size than Owari, and it's somewhat kind of the nexus of road networks in central Japan, where two of the major roads from Kyoto, the capital in central Japan, to the east run through it. So it's a pretty strategic province to have, and it takes a while, but through diplomacy and bribery, by 1567 he's weakened them enough to besiege and take the main castle at Inabiyama, which he then renames Gifu. This renaming is symbolic because it's a reference. It's the Japanese reading of the Chinese location where the Zhou dynasty was founded way back in the early days of Chinese imperial lines. Also at the same time, he begins using his famous Tenkafubu seal, which translates as all the realm through force. So at this stage, he now is in control of two provinces, which are small but strategically and economically beneficial. And he's making these things which, in hindsight, we can clearly see are signals of this ambition. We often have the impression that the imperial court in Kyoto was impotent because it had no independent military or economic power, but it still carried immense political, social, and ritual power. And Nobunaga respected that greatly. The previous shogun, Ashikaga Yoshiteru, had been assassinated in 1565 and replaced by a puppet. So Yoshiteru's younger brother, a man by the name of Ashikaga Yoshiaki, had been traveling around the provinces trying to seek a benefactor who could back his claim and help him march on the capital. So shortly after Nobunaga establishes himself in Gifu, Yoshiaki arrives on his doorstep in 1568, thus giving him a pretext to make his move on the capital. So in November of 1568, he enters Kyoto with his army and installs Yoshiaki as the 15th Ashikaga shogun. However, here's where things start to differ from what you might have expected at the time. Because rather than accept Yoshiaki's offer to be his deputy shogun, Nobunaga declines that and any other position that Yoshiaki offers. And we often interpret this as he didn't want to be under the direct authority of the shogun, confined to a specific role. He rather wanted to retain kind of the freedom of action as the real muscle making things happen.
It's fascinating that even with all of his ambition and his desire to reunite Japan to some extent, it's been fractured for more than a century, but he's still not looking to sweep away the idea of a shogun and an emperor and a capital in Kyoto. He's not looking to sweep the board clean. He's looking to rebuild those existing structures to be the scaffold that holds them up and makes them work again.
Absolutely. There's a lot of debate between historians about whether he was a revolutionary figure or a conservative figure. Was he trying to establish a new Japan, or was he trying to restore an old Japan? And I think long term, what he was trying to do was reestablish that central authority over all of the territory of Japan at this time and end the chaos that we associate with the Sengoku period. But he realizes that he can't just do that, through winning battles, that things do have to change. So he wanted to buttress the previous order and reform it in ways that were sustainable, I think.
Rather than whether he was a revolutionary or a conservative, we need to try and work out whether he was a conservative revolutionary or a revolutionary conservative.
Right. We do need to look at him as a pragmatist, but we can still recognize the horror, especially from our modern standpoint, of what some of his actions entailed. I mean, he was certainly not a merciful man, and if you opposed his authority, he was going to destroy you.
He sounds a little bit to me like someone who struggled with people who weren't as gifted and competent and driven as he was, and given that he's possibly one of the most gifted and competent and driven men of his time, kind of no one was able to keep up with him, and nobody met with his approval, and he was almost destined to fall out with everybody eventually.
Ashikaga Yoshiaki, obviously, as the shogun, felt that he should be in charge. After being installed in 1568, he attempts to rule, but he quickly sees that he cannot do anything without Nobunaga's help. And by 1572, there's some real tension between the two over who's in charge. Until 1573, when it's very obvious that Nobunaga has run out of patience. And if Nobunaga were the kind of my way or the highway, I'm here to just rule everything myself person, I'm not sure he would have lasted until 1573. But in 1573, he does march on Kyoto and expel Yoshiaki, which more or less ends the Ashikaga shogunate for good. That said, we mentioned whether he is a conservative revolutionary or a revolutionary conservative. I would say that he was probably a revolutionary conservative because he does want to keep, the structures in place. He just wants that role as kind of the center of political power. And perhaps it's because he recognizes that he's competent and many of these others are not, that he, recognizes he should be the one pulling the strings, right?
We know that Nobunaga would not live to see a united Japan. What happens to him in the end?
Through the course of the 1570s, he's able to continue defeating enemies, expanding his power, bringing other daimyo into his fold, or defeating and removing them. And we get to, the end of the 1570s and into 1580, where he really reaches kind of his zenith. And one of the few remaining enemies in, the main island of Japan that he is concerned about is this family called the Mori family. And he's had one of his generals, man by the name of Hashiba Hideyoshi, who we would later know as Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And this could possibly be the final straw that defeats them. So, there's quite a lot of emphasis on how important this is. And Nobunaga sends his retainer, Akechi Mitsuhide, with Akechi's army as the initial force to go reinforce Hideyoshi out west. And for reasons that are not quite clear, but of course lead to lots of speculation, Akechi decides instead of turning west to go support Hideyoshi, he's going to turn his forces east, march into Kyoto, surround the residence of Nobunaga, set it on fire. Nobunaga and his guards fight back, but are eventually overwhelmed. Nobunaga commits suicide. And then his heir as well, who is also in Kyoto, is attacked by Akechi's forces and dies. So, in one stroke, the Akechi have, they basically decapitated the Oda family and thus ended Nobunaga's career.
It seems like an odd end for a man who had so much success against all of his enemies to be brought down by someone he would have considered a friend or an ally, even if he hadn't been particularly good to him. What do you think we should consider to be Nobunaga's legacy? He loomed so large over this whole period, yet didn't quite complete his own project.
So, Nobunaga's the first of what are often called the three unifiers, right? We have Nobunaga, then we have Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who kind of picks up the pieces afterwards and carries on the unification of Japan. And then once he dies in 1598, Tokugawa Ieyasu takes over and establishes his own shogunate based in Edo, present-day Tokyo. So, there's the famous saying where, Nobunaga planted the seeds, Hideyoshi harvested the rice, and Tokugawa Ieyasu ate the cake, right? There's some truth to that, right? Nobunaga, one of the things that he institutes in large scale, though not systematic scale, is land surveys. What this does is it establishes tax registers, it establishes known income values, and it enables Nobunaga to award pieces of land or rights to the land to his subordinates. He starts doing this. It's really Toyotomi Hideyoshi after him who turns it into a systematic evaluation of the entire Japanese realm. Without Nobunaga having started doing that, who's to say Hideyoshi would have been able to do some of the things he did? So that's one. he's one of the first military commanders who is able to have subordinate commanders in control of their own armies mounting independent campaigns against multiple enemies at once, right? And that's something that we don't see before this in the same sort of strategic scale. And then this idea of the samurai and they are the political actors, I think, is one of his enduring legacies. He destroys independent, non-warrior institutions, with the exception of the imperial court. It's his notion that everything needs to fall under the central civil authority, and that there's no independent religious or other institutions that really matters. In these ways, these are somewhat revolutionary ideas that his successors bring forward and have shaped their policies, and which have then, of course, shapes the direction of Japan after him. But I think it's saying too much to say that, he was a revolutionary who wanted to make all these changes. All of these changes came in large part as part of his somewhat conservative goal of reestablishing central authority.
Well, Chris, it's great to have you back to talk about the unification of Japan. And who were some of the main players in the process of the unification? And we've talked a bit about Oda Nobunaga. How close to unifying Japan is he by the time he dies?
So I think by the time he dies in 1582, he has control of large parts of Japan's main island, the long, thin island of Honshu. Contains places like Tokyo, as it's now called, Kyoto, of course, Osaka. For centuries, really, the central part of that central island has been considered, as it were, the business end of Japan. That's where a lot of the power plays go on, the culture is developed, the economy is at its strongest. And Oda Nobunaga has control of most of that. And he's thinking about moving into two other of Japan's main islands, Kyushu, which is towards the southwest, and also the smaller island of Shikoku. So he's got lots of plans. He's still a relatively young man. He's in an extraordinarily powerful position, and he's just setting out in early part of 1582 for the next part of that campaign, when he's attacked actually not by his enemies, but by someone who is supposed to be on his side. But then, there he is dying by his own hand, and the next unifier comes along, I suppose.
So what comes next? What follows Nobunaga's death?
So you have this, another kind of rags to riches type figure, actually, although even more rags than in Oda Nobunaga's case. A man called Hideyoshi Toyotomi is the name that he eventually uses in any case. Very lowly foot soldier. Now and again, he carried the sandals of Oda Nobunaga, but nevertheless, he rises through the ranks to be a senior and trusted man under Oda Nobunaga. So immediately, he rushes from where he's been fighting over to take care of the traitors, and he brings the traitors' head back to Kyoto to effectively lay at the feet of Oda Nobunaga's body to say, here we are, I've taken care of this for you. And Hideyoshi really then becomes the inheritor, I think, of this project to try to unify Japan. And his major next step, one of the steps that Oda Nobunaga would have taken had he lived, was to attack island of Kyushu. So he sends around 250,000 men over to Kyushu to take it for himself, which he manages to do in fairly short order in 1586 and 7. I think one other thing that distinguishes Hideyoshi probably is the sheer scope of his ambition. So for Oda Nobunaga, what he wanted to do was to try and maintain power in the central part of Japan on Honshu, Kyoto at the center, as we've said. Hideyoshi, once he's taken Kyushu, just a few years later, launches invasions of Korea, wanting to use it almost as China's driveway, if you think about the geography of it. Send these troops up through Korea, take over the peninsula, eventually invade and take over China. And after that, he also wanted to take over India as well. It's almost as though for Hideyoshi, it's pretty much job done, I think, by 1590, which is when his final major opponent in Eastern Japan is overcome. So perhaps it's natural that he would start to look outwards and think, where next?
So is Hideyoshi the individual that we should think about as the final unifier of Japan, the man who successfully achieves what's taken more than 100 years to get to?
there is one final figure who most of us would consider to be the man who really establishes things, because although Hideyoshi has done very well by 1590, as I say, he pretty much has most parts of Japan wrapped up under his control, and he's starting to think about internal administration. He introduces measures, for example, to disarm the peasantry. So if you want to end this period of all against all warfare, he wants to return to a position where most people cannot bear arms. And it's very clear who can and who can't, and where you sit in these various samurai hierarchies. So he does all these bits of internal administration too. And I suppose another thing he starts to do is to launch these surveys of the land, something that Oda Nobunaga had started to an extent, but Hideyoshi really goes for it, to get a sense of who going forward owns what in Japan, what kind of tax you ought to pay. So the things that, maybe strike some fans of history as a bit dull, but nevertheless are a sign, I think, of a new order starting to entrench itself. So he does all that, but unfortunately, he dies when his son Hideyori is still too young to assume power. And so you have this council of elders who are controlling things until Hideyori is old enough to rule by himself. But unfortunately, on that council of elders is one Tokugawa Ieyasu, who, while professing a certain amount of loyalty to Hideyori, is plotting and scheming instead to take it all for himself. And so he becomes our third major figure. The beginning of that is probably with one of these great battles in Japanese history, the Battle of Sekigahara, which happens in 1600. So you've got a couple of nervous years after the death of Hideyoshi. This council in place, but people are wondering really whether it will stick. And what happens instead, I think, is you get the build-up of two sides that take the form in the end of an Eastern and a Western army. And Tokugawa Ieyasu is at the head of the Eastern army. And in the autumn of Sekigahara, he wins out. And really everything goes to him, and shortly afterwards he has himself appointed shogun. So you have the return of that title that's been so powerful centuries before in Japan. And again, that sort of looks like he's wrapped things up. We're thinking about around the period of 1603 or so by this point. And one thing he does manage to do, I think quite successfully, is he stations some troops in Kyoto to keep the emperor under a watchful eye, not necessarily because of what the emperor might do, but what people might use the emperor for. Some of his Western enemies, as in the western part of Japan, might potentially take the emperor as a figurehead and launch a further action against him. It's not as though after a great battle like that, everyone on the losing side thinks, fair enough, you've got me, I'll walk away and agree to this. So he has that power established in Kyoto. His own power base is Edo, this castle town that is now the great city of Tokyo. So his shogunate is really run out of Edo. That's where his advisors are, his castle is, his strong economy is, and he manages to really build up Edo, I think, in short order. He also, the other thing he does, which is really establishing this process of unification, really establishing the new Japan, is he does this enormous reshuffling of territory in Japan. I think it's the biggest reshuffling of territory in terms of who controls what in Japan's history. So lots of the people who are on the losing side at the Battle of Sekigahara either lose everything, or their territory is drastically cut down, or they're shipped off to another part of the country entirely, perhaps. All these things that are designed to damage their power. He also, as part of that reshuffle, takes over a system that Hideyoshi used to use called Sankin Kwotai. Basically, it's an alternate attendance system is what it means. In fact, it's a hostage system. And under that system, the daimyo has to be in Edo each alternate year. And when the daimyo isn't there, when he's back in his own domain, key members of his family have to be in Edo instead. So that if he does anything back at home, he launches some kind of attack on Tokugawa Ieyasu, then his family will all be slaughtered. So all these different moves that he starts to make, I think, in those early years after Sekigahara, really give you the impression, anyway, of someone who's starting to entrench their power and launch Japan on this brand new path.
We've talked about the preference, it seems like, in Japan for it to be a unified country again, that was the end goal of a process of sort of 100 years of war. Given that that seems to be what most people wanted, were there any real obstacles along the way? Were there those who would have preferred things to stay fractured? Were there those fighting against the unification of Japan?
I think there were those certainly after 1600 who resisted the idea of the Tokugawa dynasty establishing itself and taking over. So, after Sekigahara in 1600, you've got a lot of these Western daimyo who are, to put it colloquially, I suppose, seriously cheesed off about what has happened. And very importantly, I talked about the emperor being possibly one potential figurehead if they were going to launch an attack on the Tokugawa and their allies. Because, of course, seen from our point of view, the Tokugawa dynasty lasts for 250 years. But in 1600, in 1601, in 1602, this is a blip. This isn't necessarily something which is going to last any time at all. So whether you might gather around the emperor or whether you might gather around the still surviving son of Hideyoshi, this young boy Hideyori, who is holed up in Osaka Castle, there is still that sense of a prospect for having another go at that conflict and, if possible, getting a second outcome. So I think probably this is why some historians don't think about 1600 as being the end of the Sengoku period. They would probably go on another 30 or 35 years. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is that Hideyori is still around. And that really isn't taken care of until a very famous incident, 1614 to 15, which is the siege of Osaka. It's one of these events in Japanese history which is told and retold on the stage, in books, in films, in art even, where the forces of the Tokugawa and their allies gather around Osaka Castle, trying to do some kind of deal, trying to force Hideyori and those around him to give up. But in the end, the siege turns bloody, the castle is on fire, and we have these famous scenes of Hideyori and his mother huddled together as everyone around them is burning up and dying. So the siege of Osaka, I think, is a really big event because that is probably the last moment at which you've got a really credible figurehead for opposing the Tokugawa. So once that's done, 1615, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu passes away the next year, a lot of people would probably see that as being more or less the end of things. But I think there's probably one final chapter that's worth thinking about, even just quite briefly, because Hideyoshi particularly disliked foreign Christian power in Kyushu. There's a sense that Japanese Christians aren't entirely to be relied upon. There's always been the sense in Japan, as they put it in the modern era, that you can't simultaneously be loyal to two J's, Jesus and Japan. And although they wouldn't quite have put it like that in this era, there's still that sense that these people aren't fully loyal to the legitimate authorities in Japan. And so probably the last development in this long process of unification is the shutting down almost completely of Japan's borders. The Japanese will only deal, when we're thinking about European powers, with the Dutch, and only at this little artificial island called Dejima, just a few feet worth of wooden bridge off the coast of Nagasaki. So this process of warring states, then these long years of unification, ends up with a sense that Japan's security going into the future relies to some degree on preventing foreign interference.
And once unification is complete, whenever we decide that might actually have been,
yeah,
do they view this as going back to the way things should have always been done? Or is this seen as a new start for a new country?
I'm going to give you the boring historian's answer and probably say that it's a bit of both. In terms of it being new, certainly new in the context of the past century or so, if you were, your average cultivator out in the fields, you no longer had that same risk of being called up as a foot soldier, having your fields trampled over, having your money, your crops taken to feed an army. I think there's an enormous degree of stability that Japan begins to enjoy from the early 1600s. And you see the economy start to boom as a result. And probably the last big part of it here, maybe two last big parts of it here. One is the creation of a social hierarchy, which in some ways grows out of the past, but it's enforced down to the letter, even in terms of what grade of cotton or silk you might be able to wear, depending on where you fall in the hierarchy. There's a sense that just as you secure your borders, so you also secure yourself socially from the inside by having a relatively stratified society and really trying to keep to that. I suppose a very last thought about what this means for Japan in the early decades of 1600s and onwards is that in cities like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, you start to have the flourishing of a beautiful urban culture. It becomes called the culture of the floating world. So Japan has, I think, real golden years, the second half of the 1600s in particular, which if you compare, I suppose, to what's going on in Europe at the time, it's quite an enviable level of peace that Japan enjoys.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking on the link in the description. For more great videos in history, hit the links on the screen. Do you see what I did there? History hit the links? No? Okay, sorry.